Welcome back to Out of the Fog. Well, Heather Elliott is a museum professional, an avid reader, and maritime historian who's been studying maritime history and culture since she was a very young girl, with a particular interest or focus on passenger liners between the late 1800s and 1945. And she has a blog. It's called The Original Shipster, and she's here to give us all a little lesson in history, as today, of course, we remember the SS Florizel, its passengers and the crew as they headed out for an ill-fated voyage on their regular route to New York. I'd like to welcome you to Out of the Fog. It's great to have you here in studio.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, so before we start talking about the SS Florizel, of course, and their obviously ill-fated journey that they were making towards New York, I'm just wondering, where did this interest start for you?
I'm not entirely sure. My parents aren't entirely sure either. From as long as I can remember, probably since about 4 or 5, I was reading about the RMS Titanic and the White Star Line, and my interest just kind of grew from there. And I've been living in Newfoundland now for 4 years. I'm from Ontario originally, and just living out here has really helped me be able to learn more about maritime history and diversify my interests. So I started up the Original Shipster as a way to kind of have a medium to tell these stories that I was finding, because Newfoundland especially, and all along the Maritimes, is so rich with maritime history and a lot of stories that people don't know. And I was finding stories from places like here where you would expect, and then other places like Saskatchewan where you wouldn't really think of finding shipwrecks, but there are some. So that's kind of where my interest lies.
When coming here, you obviously talk about, the maritime, marine industry, the fishing industry is just such a huge part of our culture here in Newfoundland and Labrador. Was it almost like, a girl in a candy store almost in that sense? Unfortunately, we talk about some terrible, disasters that have happened on the seas, but there has been so many.
It's true, and it was sounds really morbid, but it was great when I moved here. I was notorious for being found just wandering up and down the harbor, just checking out the boats that we're in and researching them and writing about them. And I find the stories, as sad as they are, very interesting, because it is a very important aspect of Canadian history and Newfoundland history that not a lot of people know. And really, if you think about it, wherever there's a waterway, whether it's a river, a lake, the Atlantic, there's going to be a shipwreck. There's a story there. And a lot of Canadians, I don't think, realize how important maritime history was to the development of our country. So that's something that I take personal interest in, is learning as much as I can about that part of our history.
Okay, so let's start talking about the SS Florizel. This was a bit of a, I guess we can call it a disaster that took place years ago, 1918, when they set out for a voyage to New York, which was, but how I was reading about it said it was a regular voyage that they would, it was nothing uncommon for them.
So the Florizel it sailed under the Red Cross line, which was owned by Bowring Brothers. And it was called that because the Bowring ensign is actually a red St. Andrew's cross, and that was what they had painted on all of their ship's funnels, was a red cross. And the Florizel, when she was commissioned in 1909, it was to take over the St. John's, Halifax, New York route from the SS Sylvia, which had been wrecked the year before. So to leave from St. John's just to head to Halifax, it was their standard route. There was nothing out of the ordinary. The unfortunate part was they sailed into really poor weather, and that started sort of a chain reaction that ended in the ship being wrecked.
So what particularly do we know what exactly went wrong?
So what happened was, as they left, when they left St. John's, the weather was fine-ish, as fine as you can expect it to be in February. But unfortunately, as they carried on, this blizzard blew in, and with the high seas and the reduced visibility, they weren't making as much time as they had hoped to. There was also the case of the chief engineer had family who lived in Halifax, and he had kind of hoped that if he could delay the Florizel's arrival in Halifax by a couple of hours, he would be able to go ashore and see his family, and they'd have to spend the night, and then he could get back on the boat and carry on to New York. So he had slowed the engines. The captain couldn't take any readings because there was ice, so he couldn't really gauge how fast they were actually going. And after 9 hours of steaming out of St. John's, he did his calculations and figured, okay, well, roughly by now we should be past Cape Race, and he gave the order to start going around the southern shore. And unfortunately, he miscalculated. They were actually only just past Cap Hayden, and he drove the Florizel right into the side of the island, unfortunately.
There's one particular story, and I think not many people might know this little girl's name, Betty Munn, but they definitely know, a lot of people, especially in the St. John's area, know a statue that exists in Bowring Park. Just give us an idea of who Betty Munn was.
So Betty Munn was the granddaughter of Sir Edgar Bowring, who was, he owned Bowring, and she was traveling with her father to go to, I believe it was Halifax. She was only 3 years old. She was traveling with her nurse, and in the aftermath of the collision, as the ship was breaking up, she was on deck with her father, and a wave came and took her and her father right off the deck of the ship. And because she was such a prominent face in the city, and obviously a member of the Bowring family, the Bowrings commissioned the Peter Pan statue, which now sits next to the duck pond in Bowring Park, because in one quote I saw said she was a little girl who had always loved the park. So that was put up in her memory, and Peter Pan was one of her most beloved fairy tales. So that was the connection there.
Why do you think it's so important, as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, as Canadians, that we remember these moments in history?
I think they're important, just as I said before, they tell a specific story of a time in our history. Ships like the Florizel, people don't do the coastal trips anymore, but as you said at the start of this interview, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It's not like they were embarking for the New World or anything like that. It was the equivalent of somebody getting in their car and driving down the road to go to work. And I just think it's so important to see that part of our history and understand that, to get to where we are today, this was where we came from.
Okay, well, Heather, I want to thank you very much for joining us. And if anybody actually wants to check out your blog, just quickly, how can they do so? You can find me online. It's originalshipster.com, and I'm also on Twitter and on Facebook. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for coming in, and lots of information for us tonight.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to take a very short break, but stay with us. Still more to come here tonight on Out of the Fog.